Okay, so I have been taking a lot of really rich walks lately on Nose Hill and along the river. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but the vibrancy of the greens has been incredible because of all of the rain that we've had. And it seems to me that Calgary sort of does two colors. We do a faded green and a brown. Usually that's kind of what we're working with, depending on our seasons. So it's been, I have been, we do white. Yeah, it doesn't last though. It comes and then it goes really quickly. Um, so the shades of green that have emerged are really breathtaking. And when I'm walking on Nose Hill, I feel like I'm walking in Ireland or something. I'm going to touch a hedgestone and be transported in time. But when I'm walking and I'm sitting and I'm noticing the beauty of God's creation, the radiance of sister trees, I also have this sort of sense of forlornness because I know that in 90 days or so, they're going to go. Their leaves will change color and they'll fall. And I hate to be that summer buzzkill guy, but that's just kind of the way that nature seems to move. Nothing seems to last forever. And so as the days grow shorter and the temperatures begin to drop, the tree starts to draw its life inward. And the sugars and nutrients that once flowed freely to the leaves are gathered back into the trunk and roots, and they're stored away for the winter. So the tree actually, at this place where the stem meets the branch, the tree will secrete a fluid that will block the leaf's ability to draw life from the tree. That's what's going on. And then so that boundary, and then the brilliant reds and the oranges and the golds that captivate us each autumn are simply the final colors just revealed before the green chlorophyll fades away. And then one by one, the tree just lets go of each leaf. And if the tree had clung to its leaves all through winter, it would be crushed by the snow. It would be stirred up by wind and it'd be unable to conserve its energy needed for spring. So what looks like loss from the outside in many ways is an act of wisdom. And the tree releases what it can't sustain anymore, and then trusting that life remains even when the branches disappear. And beneath the frozen ground, unseen by anyone passing by, the roots just continue to do their work and do their thing. And I wonder, why can't we be more like trees? When our own seasons change, why can't we gracefully release what is no longer meant for us? And so one of the greatest obstacles to, I think, our peace of mind and our contentment of spirit is the tendency to cling to old resentments, to disappointments, to betrayals, to the plans that didn't unfold the way that we wanted them to, or the expectations that we carried with such care. Often, I think it's the holding on that becomes the suffering piece of it. And so the endless replaying of conversations or the moments and possibilities, and sometimes way more heavily on us than the original circumstance that happened. And if you've ever shared a grief that you're going through about something that you're trying to let go of with a friend, I'm sure you've been met by the ill-intentioned advice, just let it go. Just let it go. As though there was some kind of hidden switch in your soul that you could just flick and it'd be turned off. But it isn't that simple. And so how? How do we gracefully release what we can no longer carry? How do we make peace with what was never ours to keep? So we're in the third week of our series on practices for spiritual renewal, those ways of being with ourselves and each other and with God that lead to healing. And we began with honesty, and this was the practice of seeing things as they actually are, not as we wish they were. And then last week we explored openness, so keep loosening our grip on certainty and making room for wonder, or at very least, making room for the possibility that we don't have everything all figured out. And so today we come to surrender. And in many ways, surrender lives, I think, at the intersection of honesty and openness. We see things as they are. We become more open to what might be, and then we loosen our grip. But it's a difficult word. For many people, I think that it has been used to dismiss pain or silence or grief or pressure people to remain in situations that were harming them. Just let it go. Move on. Get over it. So that's not the kind of surrender that I'm talking about today. I think one of the greatest dangers of the spiritual life is what psychologists are calling spiritual bypass. And that's often disguises itself as faithfulness. I'm fine. It's in God's hands. I've let it go. But meanwhile, the wound remains unhealed, or the grief is unacknowledged, or the harm is unaddressed. And surrender and spiritual bypass are not the same thing. Surrender is recognizing what's beyond our control and entrusting it to God. And spiritual bypass is sort of an ostrich effect. It's refusing to face what's within our control while pretending it isn't. So I think that's the nuance. So surrender faces reality and spiritual bypass avoids it. So when I hear the word surrender, sometimes maybe we think about battle. You know, the moment where one side recognizes the truth about their situation, they've fought the good fight, they've done all they can with all the resources that they have, and now they're depleted and they have no more power to sustain the fight. And they resign themselves to their situation. So rather than being completely obliterated, they save themselves by choosing to stop the fight. They stop the resistance. So this certainly is what surrender means in a dictionary context, but I want to look at what it means as a spiritual practice, particularly as a Christian spiritual practice. So in our gospel reading today, Jesus is on the Mount of Olives praying, and he's acutely aware of what is before him, and he concedes to his own angst. Father, let this cup pass from me. And I will say part of me wrestles with the passage. For 2,000 years, Christians have affirmed that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. And yet I can't help but wonder, isn't part of being human not knowing? Isn't that part of the angst? Not being able to see what comes next, living with uncertainty or fear or the limits of our own understanding. Perhaps Jesus knew exactly what was ahead of him. He simply saw the trajectory of his own ministry. Crowds were getting larger, authorities were growing nervous, and tensions were mounting by the day. And other people had claimed to be the Messiah. There were many claims of messiahship, but many of them lined the roads on Roman crosses. So you didn't need to be a prophet to sort of see where this story might lead. Whatever it is that Jesus knew, the text is clear about one thing. He was afraid. He didn't meet this with bravado. The pain before him was real. The loss was real. The possibility of suffering cast a really long shadow on the road ahead, even if he knew what was at the other end of that suffering. But he moves forward. This is, I think, what captures me about this moment, that it isn't certainty, it's trust. So at the intersection of fear and faith, he places his life in God's hands. Not my will, but yours be done. And in many ways, this is the moment of surrender for Jesus. I would argue this is where he gave up his life. Long before the nails or the cross, here in the garden, Jesus releases his grip and like a tree, releases its leaf. So Richard Rohr says that when we all approach the spiritual practice of surrender with such resistance and difficulty, because it's a death, whether it's the death of a plan or the vision or the way we had planned our life to be, it's a death. And so this kind of surrender, this spiritual surrender, is not just a resignation of loss only. I think it's an immediate trust that there's a better plan at work. God's plan, stepping into alignment with it. And this is really evident in Pauline spirituality, for sure, in Paul's constructs. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ in me. Or knowing this, that our old person was crucified with him, that the body of illusion might be done away with, that we should no longer be enslaved to illusion, to the presence our bodies as to present our bodies as living sacrifice. Paul affirms daily that he dies with Christ. What is this if not surrender that he's referring to? And so I'm thinking about the spirituality of the desert fathers and mothers as well, and all the monastic traditions. Abba Nilis, the elder, says, "Do not always be wanting everything to turn out as you think it should, but rather as God pleases. Then you will be undisturbed and thankful in your prayer." Now, the desert fathers and mothers were super intense people. They went and lived in a cave and probably lived on shrubs and grain that they found on the ground. But the intensity of their experience of God was also really profound, so much so that their writings exist today. So the letting go of our way and the stepping into alignment with God's way, or the way of love, surrender is one of the most critical practices, I think, of Christian faith. And many of us grew up in traditions where we entered the Christian story through a moment of surrender. Whether, I don't deny the power of that moment. And some people describe it as being born again, or some people describe it as inviting Jesus into your heart, and for whatever that means. But my only wrestling with that piece is that, that one and done sort of idea is that we are in fact being born again and again and again and again. Even Paul says we're being transformed from glory to glory. So I think that every time that we resign, there is something that, surrender, there is a moment that happens, a newness that is born in that moment. Each time we resign our own way of doing things and surrender to God, we have these moments of surrender. So when this relationship or this work situation or this way of doing ministry or professional or personal agenda or way of being in the world just isn't working anymore. And so I've spent a lot of my life force, like a dog chasing its tail, trying to make it work my way, especially when it wasn't. So in the last month, I faced 3 significant personal disappointments. Not here, this is presently one of my greatest loves. But my own inner movement towards surrender has not been graceful, and it usually never is. And it usually looks something like this. The first movement is, it's not fair. It is not fair. And then the second movement is, this is due to some sort of collusion or sabotage or deception or puppeting or manipulation. And then I'll spin out a little more and I'll say, this injustice is because of who I am. It's because I'm bald. That's not what it is, but so I create stories. I create stories that fuel that anger and that resistance in me. And I send emails and I make little phone calls and I cry to my friends and I cry to God. But in the end, there's nothing that I can do to change the particular situation. There's nothing I can do to change it. So the need for surrender, I think, comes in this place where there is nothing that you can do to change it. Sometimes the question that people will ask is, what about social justice and what about making change? I'm like, yeah, you do the right thing, you do all the things. But when there's nothing left to do and you're still spinning out in this corner, that is usually the call to surrender. So once I've exerted all of my energy villainizing and justifying, I come to a place of exhaustion and I'll say, God, this is just not your will. Every closed door in the past has always redirected me to something even better. Maybe not immediately, but eventually, and I trust you. I trust that you're leading me to what I can't see yet. Have your way. And that is the moment that a peace settles in my spirit. And that is the moment that I have moved through my anxiety and resistance and I've accepted the truth. And that's the moment that I relent to God, knowing that God will make all things right. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I have faith that things will be made right. And so there's something supernatural in that moment, something soaked in the Holy Spirit. There's something about that moment I don't know that I would have gotten to on my own. I think it's grace. And so, even thinking about surrender, I don't know it's something that you can just land into. I think we have to go through it, but there is a sweetness to it when you find it. Perhaps we're thinking I'm leaning into a Pollyanna way of thinking too, or a naive spiritual bypass. But remember that I've just said that I've moved through the anxiety and the anger and the fear and the honesty. I've accepted the truth of the situation, and the truth of the situation is that I can't change the situation. So now, when I'm finding the surrender, I'm moving into the fact that divine flow is leading me down a new stream. And I've surrendered what was, what could have been to God. I haven't buried my head in the sand or leaned into self-defeatist or self-piteous posturing once I'm in surrender. I've done it before that. So this, I believe, is what makes a spiritual practice for renewal and not a religious illusion to make ourselves feel better. And so when it happens, we make room for what God has in store for us. We make room for possibilities. We make room for renewal. And to be clear, you don't have to surrender. If you're leaning heavily into this Pollyanna illusion argument, and you're just thinking, no, that's not for me, I will fight it to the bitter end. You can, like Frank Sinatra, do it your way. No problem. But I will say for me, it's been the clearest path to inner peace in my life. And this is what I think makes surrender a spiritual practice, because it's not surrendering from our way, but it is surrendering to God's way. And God's way is the clearest path to inner peace. And yeah, there's pain, and I believe that pain is the attachment, the holding on, the grief of loss, and more often than not, it's the resistance to letting go that causes the most suffering. So, looking at the practice, personally, surrender often looks a lot less like a heroic act and more like releasing one finger at a time from your grip. A personal prayer can be, I don't like this, I didn't choose this, but I know that this is where I am. Lead me forward. And then relational surrender can be even harder because we can't surrender another person's behavior. But we can surrender our attempts to control it. How many sleepless nights have we spent replaying conversations? How many imaginary arguments have we won in the shower by ourselves? How many times have we tried to manage another person's opinion of us? And there just comes a moment in every relationship when surrender means saying, I've said what I need to say. I've apologized for what I need to apologize for. I've spoken the truth as lovingly as I can. And then the rest we release. We surrender. And sometimes surrender means working through and releasing a resentment, and sometimes it means releasing the need to be right. Sometimes it means releasing a relationship. And I don't do this because, or we don't do this because we've stopped caring, but because love and control aren't the same thing. And then communal surrender as a practice can be the most difficult of all. We cling to our programs and our traditions and our ideas and our structures and our way of doing things. And sometimes the Spirit is leading us to something completely new. But we're gripping so tightly to what worked 10 years ago that we can't receive what God's doing now. So communal surrender asks these kind of questions. What are we protecting that no longer serves our mission? What assumptions are we unwilling to question? What outcomes are we demanding from God instead of discerning with God? And in a communal context, sometimes surrender means releasing the agenda. It means allowing our favorite idea to die, which can suck, but it's so that a better collective vision can emerge. Healthy communities are never built when everybody gets their own way. That's not the foundation of a healthy community. They're built when people become willing to listen to God's way together. And that's the difference between decision and discernment. So whether personally or relationally or communally, surrender begins the same way. We tell the truth about what is. We loosen our grip on what we can't control. And we become open to what God has in store for us. So the invitation isn't to give up or become passive or pretend like everything's okay. The invitation is to stop fighting what reality's already settled. to accept what's true, to release what we cannot change, to place what remains into the hands of the one who can bring life even out of death. And isn't that the pattern of our faith? Surrender, death, resurrection. So, some questions for us to hold with this practice. Can we allow ourselves the honesty to grieve what cannot be, what we cannot control, what is not meant for us? Can we allow ourselves to be open to the fact that what cannot be, what we cannot control, what was not meant for us could be leading us to what God would have for us? Can we, like Jesus or like a tree, gracefully let go? Amen.